Well, I'm just going to start and say this event tonight is one of the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center here in Boulder, and we have a group called the Global Peace Collective, and we are for peace and against war. And I'm going to just pass around our flyer for anyone that would like one. And we've been looking at the Russia issue for about, I don't know, a couple years now, maybe. Mm-hmm. And particularly the deteriorating relationships between the United States and Russia, which just seem to get worse all the time. I don't know if people have followed this diplomacy war that's been going out, where the U.S. kind of started it with kicking out Russians, and then the Russians responded, and then the U.S. responded again. So the diplomatic corps in both countries are being vastly reduced now. But anyway, this is just one of the areas that we work on. We also work on anti-nuclear weapons, cleanup of Rocky Flats, social justice and anti-racism work, nonviolent trainings. So we do a lot of different things. And we welcome people to become involved with us if they would like. We have a sign-in sheet in case. Is everyone on the email list that would like to be? Yeah? Okay. And Ron is going to start off. I'm Carolyn Bninski, and this is Ron Forthofer, and we both work with the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center Global Peace Collective.
Thanks, Carolyn. As you can see, we were initially advertised as a panel of 3 people, and Tom Mayer, who was to be the third person, is unable to join us tonight, so there are the 2 of us. As Carolyn said, this is an issue that we've been concerned about for quite some time in terms of the relationship with Russia. And as far as the focus of tonight's discussion, we'll be talking about the idea that there was hacking of the Democratic National Committee's emails, and that this may have played some role in the election. And so that is the focus, and we're concerned about this issue in particular with the claims that Russia was involved with this, because that seems to be playing into, as Carolyn said, ongoing campaign against Russia and trying to portray Russia as an enemy of the United States trying to change the world situation. And a lot of this goes back to 1991 period, when the Soviet Union broke up, or shortly before the Soviet Union broke up, that Chancellor Kohl of West Germany wanted to see the reunification of East and West Germany. So there was a deal that was arranged with Gorbachev, who was the Soviet Union's prime minister at the time, or premier, that called for NATO's promise that it would not advance 1 inch to the east in exchange for allowing West and East Germany to be united. So this was the understanding, and as many have pointed out, that the Soviet Union was very concerned about the expansion of NATO, because during the Second World War, it had lost about 26 million people out of its population. That was roughly about 14% of its population. And this was one of a number of attacks from the West over 2 centuries that have had devastating impacts. So the Soviet Union was not excited about the potential for a potentially hostile military alliance to be right on its borders. They wanted to have some buffer to protect it so that they could guard against any type of surprise attack or whatever. So a lot of the problems that we're encountering go back to that situation. And what we're concerned about, and in 2015 and 2016, we saw war games among NATO countries close to the Russian border. And there was a chance for a mistake to occur, and we'd be in the throes of a nuclear war. So both sides were posturing big time, and it was as if they were playing a game of chicken. And I don't want to see a game of chicken between two nuclear armed powers. So we've been greatly concerned about this potential for a nuclear war between Russia and the United States. And so when this claim now came up, we saw that as potentially something that was part of the propaganda campaign to further convince the American public that Russia was indeed a threatening enemy to the United States. And I'll just one last comment before turning back to Carolyn. On June 12th of 2016, Julian Assange of WikiLeaks announced that they were going to be releasing thousands of documents pertaining to the Democratic Party and to the Clinton campaign. And shortly after that, a couple days later, all of a sudden, there was a tension now with the DNC claiming that a private security firm cybersecurity firm had identified Russia as the source of the information that WikiLeaks had. And that looked a little strange. And what resulted from that claim about Russia being the source of a hack was that instead of the attention being focused on the contents of the leaks, a lot of the attention was focused on Russian involvement in hacking and playing a role in our electoral system. And we have not seen what we consider to be reasonable evidence that this actually ever occurred. And we keep waiting and waiting to see something that is conclusive about this. So far, we cannot be certain of that a hack occurred, and we can't be certain either that Russia didn't do anything. We're not inside the DNC and the Clinton campaign to see what their rationale was, and we're not inside Russia and Putin to know what their thinking was, whether they actually did something. But the evidence that Carolyn's going to be addressing, I think, lends credibility to the idea that it wasn't a hack. So, Carolyn.
I want to say to begin with that this isn't about whether you like Trump or you don't like Trump. I mean, there's virtually almost no policy that Trump has that I agree with, whether it's on immigration, education, Wall Street, I said immigration, climate change, environmental regulations. I mean, he basically wants to give big business full reign to do whatever they want. On tax reform, he wants to give greater taxes back to the rich and take them away from the middle class and the poor. So, you know, he's not a friend of progressives. He's not a friend of the middle class. He's really a part of the same oligarchy. However, he did have a desire to have better relationships with Russia, and he did talk about ratcheting down our wars overseas. That was one area that he actually was different than Clinton in. Now, he talked about this pretty consistently throughout his campaign. So I just want to put that as a background. You know, we're not here because we're Trump supporters. Basically, as I said, his policies are anathema to a progressive agenda. So that's one piece I want to say. The second piece is a lot of where you stand on this has to do with who do you trust. So on one side we've got the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, who wrote this memo that came out on January 6th, I believe. And in it they made allegations that Russia had influenced our elections, but there was no solid evidence in that January 6th memorandum. And that's, I'm going to start with that piece, and then we'll go kind of through a chronological order of what sort of happened in the meantime. And as the evidence has been built up over time, that there is no evidence for a hack, and then we'll get to the next part of this mystery. So this intelligence report came out in January. As you remember, it was 17 intelligence agencies. Do you remember that? And that's what they kept saying on the TV. Well, as it turns out, it wasn't 17 agencies. It was 4 agencies. It was the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, and the Director of National Intelligence's office, someone who lied to Congress about surveillance in 2013. So they lied about who was involved in this, these intelligence agencies. And I want to say that the CIA has a record of overthrowing governments, assassinating people, inciting false revolutions in countries, arming people who want to overthrow governments. So they have a long history of very nefarious activities. The NSA, as was revealed to us by Edward Snowden, is basically collecting every single piece of data on the American people that's out there. That lovely cell phone that you have, your emails, your telephone calls. I mean, everything is collected, and it's not just the metadata. It's the actual phone calls, the actual emails. And you say, well, why the heck do they want mine? Well, we don't know. They're just storing them all. So the NSA is not what you would call a protector of civil liberties and civil rights, right? Of our right to privacy. And then you got the FBI, and they have a long history of infiltrating groups, inciting violence, So these are the agencies that are now telling us that Russia hacked into our election. Not exactly a believable crowd. And as I said, the Director of National Intelligence in 2013 lied to Congress. He said, well, actually, we're not collecting data on Americans. And then this broad spread Americans data collection, and in fact they were. So it's to a large degree, this is about credibility and who in your view has credibility. These agencies have just been feeding this information about Russian hacking to the mainstream media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the television stations, and they have been spouting this nonstop for 10 months basically. So on the other side, we have a group of veteran intelligence professionals who have a lot of credibility in my mind, who have said since January that this was not a hack, it was a leak. So I'm going to start with they had a memorandum that came out right after the intelligence agencies released their report, and these are very high level people. One of them is Ray McGovern. He was actually the person in the CIA who went in every day and briefed the president on what was happening. So he was a high level guy. And then there's another guy, William Binney, who was the tech director at the NSA. And his story is interesting. He was basically saying we cannot be collecting all this data on the American people. We have to really focus in on people who are actually suspected of doing anything. And for that, he was hounded out of the NSA. And they came for him in the morning when he was taking a shower. They dragged him out of the shower. I mean, it's a very sad story. And there's a movie about him called The Good American. There's a lot of great videos about William Binney on YouTube as well. So he said, in this memo, they said, we draw on decades of senior level experience in writing this memo. We want to cut through uninformed, largely partisan fog that was happening around Russiagate. And around this, particularly this, as I said, there's a January memo. And basically what they do is they first distinguish between a leak and a hack. A leak is someone within the agency has access to computers. They have access maybe to servers. They're able to actually get the data and download it on one of those thumb drives. That's a leak. Someone within access. A hack is when you come over the internet and you get into a computer, you get through their firewalls or any other kind of protection and get into their computer. So what was claimed was there was a hack by the Russians. Again, in this January 6th memo, the intelligence agencies didn't offer any actual evidence, and just kind of it happened, but we're not gonna provide you with anything. So, basically, this first memo just said that the NSA is able to identify all information going over the internet. They can identify the sender and the recipient, and they would have been able to tell any data that went over the internet that was passed from the DNC servers or Hillary's servers to anyone else. So the fact that they never came up with any evidence that showed that that there was this evidence of a hack from outside said to them as experts in cybersecurity that the NSA didn't have the information because it didn't go over the internet. It was a leak from within. So and this very first memo in January, what they said is that these emails were not leaked. They weren't hacked. It was a leak, and in some, they say, given what we know of NSA's existing capabilities, it beggars belief that the NSA would be unable to identify anyone, Russian or not, attempting to interfere in a U.S. election by hacking. So that was their conclusion back in January. So their next memo was on January 17th, in which they wrote to President Obama, and they said, if you have the evidence, release it, because the American people need to know this. They need to know if your NSA actually has the evidence that there was any kind of a hack from outside, and nothing ever happened. That never happened. Obama didn't release anything, although at a press conference he did say he did make his last press conference. He did say something that indicated that he wasn't convinced that it was actually a hack. Obama did. So finally, on July 24th, they wrote another memo, and this relates to forensic studies of the Guccifer 2, what was claimed was a hack, and there had been an independent person that did forensics on this hack by the Guccifer 2 was supposedly the Russian hacker. This is the part that gets a little complicated.
How do you say that?
Guccifer, Guccifer 2.0.
Lucifer too?
Yeah,
It does kind of sounds like Lucifer. It's interesting.
it is interesting. And this particular memo was on Consortium News. Now their conclusion from this, now they feel very certain, unlike Ron, they feel very certain that these veteran intelligence professionals for sanity, again, I think very credible people, they actually were the ones that came out before the Iraq War and said there's no weapons of mass destruction. That was their first memo that they wrote. Since that time, they've written 50 memos, usually to the president, about the undermining or the politicization of the intelligence that is put out by the intelligence agencies, and the fact that people have become very corrupted in these agencies by careerism and by politics. And they try and present as people who are all retired now. I don't know if I mentioned that they're all former retired. They don't have anything, as much anyway, to lose by being honest as people who are still in their careers. And as I say, a lot of this boils down to looking at the evidence and making up your own mind and looking at who's saying what. And, so anyway, in this latest July 24th, this was based on a forensic investigation of the Guccifer 2 supposed hack by the Russians. And what the forensics found is that somehow this independent investigator had been able to get access to the hack that Ron mentioned, which was when the DNC came out and said we've been hacked, and then next day, Guccifer 2 comes out and says I did it, and I'm working for the Russians, and so all of a sudden there's this diversion from the emails, as Ron mentioned. The first of all, so I'm just going to give you a timeline here because it gets a little confusing. So on June 12th. So June 12th, Julian Assange from WikiLeaks announces he's going to publish emails related to Hillary Clinton. 2 days later, this DNC contractor of the DNC announces that there's malware on the DNC server and claims that it was the Russians. And on the 15th, Guccifer 2 comes out and says, yes, I did it. So I'm just going to repeat that because, so June 12th, Julian says they're going to publish some emails related to Hillary Clinton. June 14th, this DNC contractor, CrowdStrike, says they found malware on the DNC service, and it's evidence that there's evidence that it was the Russians. And the next day, Guccifer 2 says he did the hack, and he claims to be the WikiLeaks source, and he's the Russian, And they also, I guess Guccifer posts a document. No, I'm not sure what that means. So anyway, so you see, I mean, what was in those emails? Do you remember what was in those emails? It basically showed that the DNC
was totally biased toward the
Right.
Hillary Clinton campaign. That's what was in the emails, and Bernie Sanders was sabotaged.
Right, so that Bernie Sanders was sabotaged and the DNC was favoring Hillary Clinton.
Absolutely.
That's what was in the emails. But So you begin to see here a little pattern, right? So all of a sudden the Democrats find out, and this is actually what the veteran intelligence professionals believe, that that this was the second. Okay, so the first one was Julian saying we're going to release stuff, and they actually did release it on July 22nd, which was a few days before the DNC. So there had been a leak. But it appears that there were two different leaks by two different groups. The first one was a leaker from within the DNC that gave the emails to WikiLeaks. That was the first leak. The second one was the one that was claimed it was a hack. That's the Guccifer 2. But that actually, as it turns out from the forensic, wasn't a hack from this Guccifer 2. It was actually a leak as well. It was what I call a cover-up leak. It was a leak to cover up and to obfuscate the content of those emails. Are people following me? Because they didn't want people at the Democratic National Convention talking about what you just said. They screwed Bernie Sanders. They wanted them talking about the Russians did it. The Russians did it. So,
I want you to repeat that, actually. So we have two leaks.
there were two leaks.
Yeah. And
There was a leak that had been made before June 12th,
right.
which was the leak that Julian announced on that day. He said, we have some emails.
It wasn't a leak, it was just an announcement.
It was an announcement, but it was an announcement about the fact that someone had given them emails. You know, they said we're going to release emails about Hillary
They just
Clinton.
announced they were going to release emails.
Yeah.
Yeah, about Hillary Clinton.
Yeah. So someone had given those emails to WikiLeaks.
Mhm.
And the claim is that Russia hacked into the election and gave the emails to WikiLeaks, but that's actually not what happened. So what they did then is they claimed that there was the DNC contractor claimed on June 14th that there had been evidence that there was malware from the Russians. And then on June 15th, Guccifer 2 says, I hacked into the DNC. So this is where it gets really interesting. So, you know, this is like the crime of the century, right? The Russians hacking into our election. Well, guess who never saw CrowdStrike? Again, they were the private contractor that claimed that the DNC had been hacked into. Guess who never saw that information? The intelligence agencies, the FBI, asked the DNC, can we see that information? And they said, no, actually you can't.
Oh.
So it's like going to a crime, the police come to a crime scene, the roommate says my housemate was murdered. The police say, we're going to come in. The roommate says, no, you're not going to come in. I'll take some pictures. I'll send them to you later. And the police say, oh, okay. Okay, we will, it's fine. We get it. You don't want us in your apartment. I mean, that's actually what happened. You know, this was the FBI, the NSA. Nobody ever was given access to the DNC servers. There was maybe some hand-picked analysts, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. So what the forensics found was on the Guccifer 2 was that. And you know, unless you're a computer person, you might have a lot of understanding this, but what they found is that someone got access to the metadata, which is data about data. So it's data about the Guccifer 2 hack, leak. And they were able to analyze the information, and what they found was that it was downloaded at a speed that was too fast for the internet at that time, and especially if it was from Eastern Europe. It actually was downloaded at the speed that you would download to a thumb drive. And so that was one thing that, you know, the VIPS people, the Veteran Intelligence Professionals, said to them that this was not a hack, it was a leak. So that this was something that had been done by the CrowdStrike people, I guess, to say this is evidence that we were hacked into. So, but it was downloaded at too fast a speed, and they've stuck with that story. There's been all kinds of stuff on the internet questioning that, but what they say is, although there was, just because you may hear some of this, the speed there, they were saying to go from the United States to Eastern Europe would have taken a lot more time. And this guy was in Eastern Europe. He was supposedly in Romania. Then you would be able to hack from outside. So it had to be a download onto a device, and it also had a time date. It was an Eastern time, Eastern United States time, which indicated that it had been downloaded in the United States. So that was the evidence that this Guccifer 2 thing was kind of a cover-up, make-up thing. And again, you have to judge for yourself, and you can read this memo yourself. The other thing that was that was interesting was, I don't know if people have heard about Vault 7, but that was a CIA contractor leaked 2 WikiLeaks, thousands of pages, I guess, or of ways that the CIA had developed malware and spying techniques and all kinds of things that could undermine people's ability to protect themselves on the internet. Would you say that's accurate, Ron?
Yeah, in addition, it has the ability to mask things, making it look,
No, go ahead.
to make it look like it came from one location or one person hacking you when it was actually somebody else.
And they guess what they put in there? It's called Cyrillic. Is that right? Cyrillic? Cyrillic lettering, which is the Russian lettering. So there were
Cyrillic.
Cyrillic. So there were 5 different languages that were part of this program. It's called Marble, and if you want to know more about it, you can go on WikiLeaks and read about it. The problem with some of the stuff on WikiLeaks is it's very technical, so you have to have some computer savvy. So we have to kind of depend on people who have that to interpret it for us. But this Marble was they call it obfuscate. They're able to obfuscate hacks, and then they're able to deobfuscate. So if you went in there, you wouldn't know that it had been deobfuscated. So it's like they're able to do both.
Yeah, the one other point about this Guccifer, they found this malware that had a Russian signature in it, basically.
Yeah.
And they said that if this hack was so sophisticated and the people were so talented and competent that they were able to pull this off, it's highly unlikely that they'd be so sloppy to leave these clues in there that would point to Russia.
I listened to both William Binney and George Ray McGovern have been on programs with LaRouche PAC. Now that's a kind of a right-wing group, but they cannot get on mainstream television, even though they have, huge knowledge and huge information. They are not. That avenue is closed to these very highly skilled, professional, credible people, and so because they have evidence that contradicts the official story. But LaRouche PAC, they had 2 programs recently with LaRouche PAC.
LaRouche.
Yeah,
Okay.
and in that I think it's Ray McGovern says that to him, it's pretty obvious that the CIA was involved in this, hack cover-up, because he said this CrowdStrike, they didn't have the sophistication, they didn't have the access to the Marble program, they didn't have the ability to obfuscate. So this was a very high-level operation within the government, was his take on it. Again, you have to decide for yourself, and I do think it's worth watching William Binney and Ray McGovern on these two programs, because I think they speak to a lot of the concerns that come up for people.
These are YouTubes?
YouTube,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm going to try and put all this together and put it on the Peace Center email so you can get all the links, but you can probably find it. Yeah.
Okay.
These have just been in the last month. One was about a week and a half ago, and the other was, and you can, if you don't want to watch the beginning introductions, you can skip over to where they start. That's kind of their take on this. I want to mention a few other things. I know I'm going on for a long time, and I want to give this back to Ron. So there's some other things that I think they may be, some of them I think are pretty strong evidence, some may be circumstantial evidence, but when you put all this together, you really begin to question the official story. There are two credible witnesses who have said that the Russians were not involved in the transfer of data to WikiLeaks. One was Julian Assange. He has said this was not Russia and that it wasn't a state actor. They did not get their information from Russia or a state actor. And Julian Assange's information has never been questioned. I mean, he's released 10 million documents, and nobody has ever questioned the veracity of his documents or what he has claimed. I mean, the guy has, he tells the truth, and I happen to like him a lot. Some people don't, but I think he does tell the truth. The second person is.
So he said this was not Russia, and what was
It wasn't.
the second
It
thing?
was not any state actor.
Oh, that's it.
The second person was a guy named Craig Murray. He was the former British ambassador to Uzbekistan. It's Uzbekistan, right? And he said that he was actually the one. He came over from Britain and got the information from the person who had released the DNC emails to WikiLeaks. So that's the first thing that we talked about. So both of these people, credible people, guess who never interviewed them? Yes, the FBI. They never interviewed these people.
And Craig Murray, what did you say he got?
He actually collected the information from the leaker in Washington D.C. and took it back to WikiLeaks.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry, I didn't make that clear.
No, you said.
That's what he claims.
Um,
And did Assange say at any point that he had received that information from Craig Murray?
no, he hasn't said that.
Oh.
But he hasn't said he didn't too. And Julian's pretty. I mean, they don't reveal their sources. Another really interesting thing. Well, I'll get into that in a minute here. I'm just giving you information, and if it doesn't sound right to you, you can discard it. But I've been following this now for 10 months, and I think, rather than you having to go and discover this stuff, it's useful. And, the other thing, in this original document, that, that January 6th document I told you about from the intelligence agencies, that said, Russians interfered in the election. At the end of that document, I mean, this is really interesting. They actually say, I hope I can find this because it really is quite interesting. They basically say, here it is. They said that this was an assessment. It was kind of a really mealy-mouthed thing, but they say, listen to this. This might ring some historical bells. This is on page 13 of that document. This is the, National Intelligence Assessment. This is the one by the CIA, the FBI, the NSA. So they say in that, on page 13, judgments are not intended to imply that we have proof that shows something to be a fact.
Oh, goodness.
Gets better.
Assessments are based on collected information, which is often incomplete or fragmentary, as well as logic, argumentation, and precedence. So, what they're saying is, everything you read in this report could be complete baloney because it's all based on conjecture, speculation, and guesswork. That's an interpretation of that statement. And this was in that document in January. So, just a few other things, and I'm going to turn this back. Again, if Russia had hacked into the DNC computers, the NSA would know about it. They haven't provided any evidence of a hack. They've never even claimed that there was a hack, or verified the claims, or presented presented evidence. And the conclusion is that they haven't provided it because it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist that this thing went over the internet to Romania. As I said, the FBI never seized the DNC servers. When the DNC refused, they just said, oh, okay, no problem. The only one that claimed that there was a hack was CrowdStrike, which was a private company who has some kind of problems with other things that they've come out with. Another piece of this is that hand-picked analysts by the agencies, did I already say that, were chosen to write this report. And for veteran intelligence professionals, what that means is that these people were chosen because the higher-ups wanted a certain conclusion, and so they chose people that they knew that would do this, career-minded people who wanted to get ahead. Let's see if there's anything else. This is an article by Mike Whitney that just came out. He said this a few days ago on Counterpunch. He says, are we supposed to believe that in the biggest case of the decade, I would say the century, a case that allegedly involves foreign espionage and presidential treason, that the FBI made no serious effort to secure the servers that were allegedly hacked by Russia? It just. And the other thing that's happened is that they've expanded this investigation. Again, I'm no fan of Trump's. Not way beyond the original scope. I mean, it was supposed to be about hacking into the election and Trump collusion and the hacking. Well, what it's become now is an investigation of all his financial transactions, all his friends, his relatives, financial...
all of his connections to Russia.
Any Russian he's ever talked to. I mean, it's become...
way beyond this.
Yeah, it's become a
True.
fishing expedition. Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
It's all the connections, every single person in the Trump campaign that had any contact with Russia, they weren't there to discuss Russian orphans.
Right. I mean, it goes on and on, but there's a lot of good stuff on the internet. I'll put that together. I want to mention a couple. Let me see. Seymour Hersh who people probably have heard of. He's a very well-known journalist, used to work for the New York Times, and he was secretly taped on an interview that he had, and he said that he had a very reliable source within the FBI that told him that a DNC staffer named Seth Rich had contacted WikiLeaks and asked for money for the DNC emails. So Seth Rich is another piece of this. He was a DNC staffer, and he was murdered shortly after. I'm forgetting exactly when that was. Was it in?
I think it was June.
In June. He was. Maybe it was shortly after Julian came out. He was murdered on the streets of Washington. They said it was.
Could have been July. Yeah.
They said it was a robbery. Nothing was stolen. He had expensive jewelry. He had cell phones. They called it a botched robbery. I mean, if you were making a movie, it couldn't be more.
Could you, Carolyn, I didn't quite get this. Seymour Hersh said he has an informant in the FBI who said that Seth Rich
had contacted WikiLeaks.
Wanting.
Asking for money and.
Asking for money.
Yeah, and apparently
For
give.
what?
For the emails, for the.
Seth Rich was a DNC
basically
staffer.
to buy the emails
Yeah,
back.
yeah.
To get the
No.
evidence.
No, he was working within the DNC. I'm sorry, I
Right.
didn't make that clear. He had been working within the DNC. He wasn't happy with what was happening to Bernie Sanders.
Right.
And there's circumstantial evidence that he may have leaked those documents. I mean, this was the closest we got from Seymour Hersh, that he had talked to a high-level FBI, someone he had been talking to for years, and felt like had a lot of reliability, and that there was evidence on Rich's computer, I guess, that he had contacted WikiLeaks and asked for money for the DNC emails.
And the right wing claims he was murdered by Hillary Clinton.
I don't get why he's asking WikiLeaks for money.
For the emails,
For the
in
emails.
exchange for
He's the one
DNC.
releasing the emails.
Oh, I see. He wanted
The
to be
original.
paid for releasing them.
For giving them
For giving
to,
the emails, so the assumption is that he wanted to be paid for
releasing
releasing them, so he was
for
the leaker.
giving the leaker who gave them
I got
the
you.
information.
Okay,
We don't
okay.
know for sure, but there's just other interesting stuff about this.
I was wanting to know about him because I was, just glancing at all sorts of things happening.
yeah, I mean, it's
that I
interesting
didn't
because
know
the
what was going on.
family, and I'll stop after this because I think I've given you everything that I need to, but, and again, Seth Rich's, the family hired a private investigator, and the private investigator, he says he usually goes down 3 avenues. One is family, and one is like relationships, another was botched robbery, and the other was work. I mean, he kind of examines those areas
You mean for the murder motive?
for the murder motive. And he was basically blocked from access from a lot of information that he normally had no problem getting. He had been he had worked for the DC Police Department. He knew people there, that they blocked every effort. They wouldn't let him see the autopsy. They wouldn't let him, they just wouldn't give him information that he always was able to get. He was also told by the brother of Seth Rich, do not look at the email issue. And he said at the time he didn't even know what that meant. Because that wasn't, so he was eventually fired, and they have now a DNC kind of person, managing the family around this issue. So it's suspicious.
A DNC person managing the family?
Yeah.
Yes, so that
the family doesn't. I mean,
try to do more investigation.
yeah,
Okay.
they fired him.
They fired
And
Seth Rich?
Seth
No.
Rich's investigator.
The investigator.
Yeah,
The DNC
yeah.
fired the
So it's just very
investigator.
fishy, I
Yeah.
mean, that again is just more speculation about the fact that this initial might have been Seth Rich. You know, we don't really know.
He's the only one working for the DNC who happened to be murdered after the fact.
Right.
So there's no one else that they can pin, you know, the leak on and say that he was killed for leaking it.
And one of John Podesta's emails that was leaked said we have to make an example of these leakers.
That was an email by John Podesta.
Yeah.
But the John Podesta emails were not leaked because of the hack, if there was a hack or whatever it was, or a leak. The Podesta emails were leaked because he accidentally gave his password. It was a phishing thing, and that's how, at least as I understand it, that's how his emails, that was a separate source of information for the public. That wasn't the DNC thing that you've been talking about.
Okay. All right, well, I'll stop there. I'm going to hand it back to Ron.
Yeah, I think Carolyn has given some explanation as why there's some question about the credibility of the claim that Russia hacked the DNC emails, and that we have some concern about that. And the concern is that that claim has really, you know, going back to the initial period last June, and then throughout the period after the Trump victory, has really taken off, and people are pointing to the Russian involvement as the reason that Hillary lost the election to Trump. And so it's now being used in an effort to be able to find a way of getting rid of Trump. Trump is also afraid to follow through if he was serious about trying to find better relations with Russia. He's unable to move in that direction because that would give the critics more evidence that Trump was in bed with Putin. And so Trump has backed off. In fact, now the United States recently has imposed additional sanctions on Russia. Part of the reason for those additional sanctions is the Russian involvement in the U.S. election and the hack. So, you know, that claim has really had a major impact on the potential for a better relationship with Russia. In fact, it's now driving us to a worse relationship with Russia. But in terms of, you try and look at the evidence to see whether, even if Russia were involved, which, you know, is highly doubtful based on the evidence that Carolyn has talked about. Yeah, and it's, Carolyn emphasized the role of Ray McGovern and William Binney. They were the, in a sense, the spokespeople for the veteran intelligence professionals for sanity. There's about 15 people involved in that group, all who have pretty solid credentials in the intelligence or foreign policy area. So they're not novices. They know what they talk about, and their track record for being right is pretty darn good. So, but anyhow, even if you were to say that, you know, the evidence that the veterans, the VIPs have presented is not conclusive or doesn't make the case in your mind, well, you'd still be very hard pressed to show that the WikiLeaks releases had much, if any, impact on the election. I went back and looked at the polls throughout from the 1st of June till the election last year, and put in the timing of the WikiLeaks releases and the announcement of the releases. And if anything, Hillary's ratings, the advantage she had over Trump, was escalating during these periods. Her ratings advantage over Trump went down right after the Republican National Convention. The gap became very close. Then right after the Democratic National Convention, she was up almost 7 points again over Trump. And she maintained a large lead until early September when it was reduced again. But there was nothing in regarding WikiLeaks at those times. The biggest drop she had was when Comey announced his November 28th letter. And that's when her
You mean October 28th?
October 28th letter.
Surprise.
Yeah, and that was when her ratings plummeted. She went from being 7 points up to 5.5 points to 2.2 points up as of November or October 31st. So the Comey letter appears to have had some impact. By November 6th, then she had risen up to 3.2 points ahead. So, and that by that time, Comey again had come out and said that, well, we find no evidence to pursue the charges against her. So, if you look at the polls, the WikiLeaks releases just, it's hard pressed to find anything.
You're looking at national polls, and it's not a national election.
Right.
State by state in the closed
Right.
states, almost anything was enough to swing the election when you're
Right.
talking about less than 100,000 votes.
Right. Nate Silver of 538.org, who's called most of the recent elections correct. This was one he missed.
The only one he missed.
Yeah.
Yeah, suspicious, highly suspicious. He was dead on every
Right.
time except now.
And Nate Silver said that, if there was anything, I mean, there are lots of reasons that the Clinton campaign lost. First of all, you had a race where you had two of the worst candidates in recent history. Two candidates who were disliked intensely by sizable portions of the population. He says that the fact that she couldn't beat the most disliked candidate says something about her.
Or that he had help.
Or that what Silver said, if there was anything, the thing that had the impact was the Comey letter on October 28th. That was the one where you could see a sizable change. The decisions that Hillary made in choosing not to go to various states, calling people deplorables, these things all entered into it. How do you say one thing or the other was the crucial thing? I think it's a combination of many, many things. Hillary's new book comes out, and I guess the major reason in her mind that she lost was Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's absolutely true.
And Comey too.
And it's absolutely true what she claims.
I'm sorry?
It's absolutely true what she claims.
It's-
That she lost because of Bernie Sanders.
Well, I think it's, in her mind, it's true that she lost because of Sanders, but
She doesn't like to take responsibility for her own faults,
Right.
like Donald Trump.
right. So you're hard pressed to make the case that WikiLeaks caused the election to swing to Trump. Jim's right, state by state, and it does vary. But she didn't herself no favors by the way she treated the people in those states that she didn't visit. I mean, she just basically ignored them. These were people that Obama had carried, and that because of the failures of the Democratic Party to deliver anything to these people, they were getting further and further behind, whereas the people that the Democratic Party was favoring was the educated professional class, the managerial class. These were the ones, as well as the super wealthy, who were benefiting from the Democratic policies. Democratic policies supported by Republicans as well. I mean, the trade deals played a tremendous role. Sanders realized that the TPP was going to be disastrous for the working population. Trump realized it too, and they both gained a lot of traction because they were taking on these things. Sanders was real in his concerns. Trump was a phony in his concerns, but Trump was smart enough to know that this was an issue that was important. So again, it's frustrating because this thing that there's very little credible evidence of Russian involvement has come about to become a major thing is impacting our foreign policy. And I would say that the U.S. mainstream media has played a major role in this because they failed miserably to act as true journalists. What they did was act as stenographers. They did not challenge the security agencies to show some evidence, show some proof for this. They didn't challenge the DNC. The DNC folks realized they had problems if Hillary's tapes were released. They had problems because of the Sanders thing, as well as the Clinton Foundation and the shady dealings that went on there. And they were concerned about this, and I think it was Podesta said, how dare they? They waited 18 months before they admitted any of this stuff to us. You know? And they were saying, we should have been able to get out in front of this a year and a half ago before she was running. So the leaks had information, but the public was distracted from really paying any much attention to these leaks because it was now the claim that Russia had been involved.
What was this about? What did Podesta say? That
They were-
I didn't understand that.
Yeah, Podesta and the Clintons,
And
good.
Podesta was, by the way, his position was.
he was the campaign manager.
Campaign manager, yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
When the second set of emails came out,
About the Gussamer, or whatever it is.
no, this was the Podesta
Oh, the
emails,
Podesta emails, yeah. okay.
that they included information from Anthony Weiner's
Okay,
emails. He was the husband of Clinton's confidant, and
okay.
she and Podesta were upset because Hillary didn't release some of this information to them about what was being said earlier on. And they said, if we could have made less of this in terms of the behavior of the DNC, in terms of Hillary's behavior as the Secretary of State, using not just private emails, but her own server. So these were things that they thought they could handle comfortably if they were given time. But in the heat of a campaign, it made it much more difficult to go through these things. But again, the U.S. mainstream media didn't act as the fourth estate. They acted as stenographers. And we've seen that before. Yeah. So,
And there's also Comey not releasing all the information about all the contacts between the Trump campaign and the Russians.
yeah.
They held that while releasing the Hillary
Yeah.
emails.
Yeah, it's interesting that in 2004 we had another intervention in the U.S. election, a major intervention by the New York Times. It had information that the Bush campaign was secretly wiretapping individuals or collecting information that was in violation of U.S. law. And they had the ability to release this story, and they delayed releasing it for 13 months. So instead of releasing it late October in 2004, they released it in December of 2005. Whether that information that the Bush administration was violating U.S. law in terms of spying on U.S. public would have thrown the election to Kerry is unknown. But the New York Times did that on its own after talking to the Bush administration. And that's something that has not been paid much attention to, but it seems like that's a very crucial thing. The other thing that is of a major concern is,
Wait, but you started off saying that was an intervention?
yeah, they made a decision as which side they were coming down on.
Oh, okay.
And
The-
they've never come out on the side of the Democrats, the FBI.
Well, no, this was the Bush administration.
Right, the FBI, well, you're saying New York Times Press, not the FBI.
Right. Right. The other thing that is an embarrassment, and I think countries around the world have to be, in a sense, relishing this, in a sense, because the United States has intervened time and time again in the election process, in the governing process of country after country, as Carolyn mentioned earlier,
Including Russia.
including Russia in 1996. Yeltsin was running for re-election, and he was like in third or fourth place. I mean, he was in the bottom rung of the candidates. And a communist candidate was in position to win. The polls showed him having overwhelming support. And Clinton intervened in a big way, as well as some NGOs and private consulting companies from the United States, to in the last month or two, to turn the Russian election around so that Yeltsin was reelected. And Yeltsin was a guy that Clinton felt we could do business with. So, but you know, you talk about Iran or Guatemala or Chile or Brazil, or on, Ukraine. It just goes on and on. And so why do we get ourselves tied up in knots when somebody else is alleged to have done something when we don't have any proof that they have done something? Now, I will say that I think Mueller will find something. He's not going to find something about Russia. I don't think he will find anything about Russia hacking or Russia having influenced the election. But I think, as Jim is suggesting, that there are lots of things that you could nail Trump on in terms of financial arrangements with Russia. Now, whether those are illegal or not, it's for somebody who's better versed in this to make some determination. But I think if Mueller finds anything, that's going to be the kind of stuff that he finds, is with people in the Trump campaign who have made deals or whatever. But as far as the hacking of the DNC emails, this is the thing that has driven all of this. This has driven the campaign against Russia. And we're afraid that this is part of the campaign to further convince the American public that Russia is the enemy and that it's going to be all right if we have to go to war with Russia. We cannot allow a foreign power to intervene in our election. The other thing is, we have allowed Israel to intervene in our election from time immemorial, the way it seems. And people forget the 2012 election when Netanyahu was pushing his buddy Mitt Romney for president. And commentators in Israel were concerned that Netanyahu had crossed a line, and many informed commentators in the United States were concerned also that Israel had crossed a line here. And why is that not a concern?
Because Romney lost.
Because Romney lost, but shouldn't that have been a concern if we are principled people? And how many policies that the United States is implemented? I mean, look at the case for the Iran treaty right now. Okay, the nuclear treaty with Iran. Trump is trying to find a way to undermine that, because I think part of Trump's policies are driven by the desire to undercut most things that Obama accomplished. This was one of the better things that Obama did, was to be able to reach a negotiated settlement on a foreign policy issue. And Israel did everything in its power including inviting Netanyahu to testify or to speak before U.S. Congress. Boehner, the Republican House Majority Leader, invited Netanyahu to participate, and neither Boehner or Netanyahu bothered to check with the Obama administration about this. Obama found out about it when it was announced. So, Israel has a means of trying to sway a lot of our foreign policy positions as well, and we don't complain about that.
I complain about APEC all the time.
Yeah, how much effect do you have? Have you seen a media campaign about this?
But thank you.
Media is totally pro-Israel.
So, I mean, the hypocrisy that goes on here, both in terms of the U.S. complaining about the possibility that somebody intervened versus concrete proof that the U.S. has intervened time and time again in other countries' elections or changing of their government, just really reeks. So, yeah, I'm finished.
I just wanted to mention a couple of things. Is that the campaign against Russia really stepped up. Putin's been there since 2000 as president, and he switched back into another position, prime minister, I guess. But he has been seen as kind of the leader of the country, even when he was not the president but the prime minister, because of their election laws. He had to step down for a term. But in 2007, Putin came out and said, we can't have a unipolar world. That's too dangerous. We have to have a multipolar world. And then, the campaigns really stepped up against him. I mean, even since the beginning, because he's someone who wants to have an independent foreign policy. He wants to focus on the economic situation of the Russians. So he's very much focused on what happens for the Russian people, which is a legitimate thing for a leader to do. He's
the
been
kleptocracy that's going on there. He's focused on benefiting the Russian people.
They're doing
killing off journalists, violent suppression of the LGBT community. He's a hardcore fascist that's not any better than Adolf Hitler. Maybe that's why he's not looked upon kindly by so many people on the American left.
Well, I would disagree with your assessment, but I don't want to get into that right now because I want people to be able to get a chance. But what I was going to say is that he does have an idea that you can't have just one country like the United States dominating everything on the planet. And that's when the demonization of Russia really stepped up. And there's been a lot of misinformation about him, I believe, from what I've seen in the American press as part of this demonization campaign. But also, I just wanted to mention that as a result of this, he has been very pushed to an alliance with China, a military alliance and an economic alliance. So you have, the biggest economic power now. I think China just surpassed the United States in terms of economic power, and Russia have gotten together, along with some other countries, to build a separate economic union to be able to be outside of the grip of the neoliberal U.S.-led economic order. So that's part of the picture of what's happening now. You're seeing these alliances form among other countries to challenge the hegemony of the U.S. economically. And there's also military ties now between China and Russia, to both nuclear armed states, and they're both in the crosshairs of the U.S. As military targets. So I'm going to go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, just in closing, I think the position that we're talking about here of trying to really have proof before we act on charges. We have a policy in this country that supposedly says you're innocent until proven guilty. We haven't seen any proof. But in so doing, we have encountered a lot of opposition and animosity from people who are our friends because they have accepted what the DNC CIA, FBI, NSA, and the media are telling them. And again, I want the media to do its job, and it's not doing it.
I want to just say one other thing here is that people are so want to get rid of Trump that they are willing to go along with the story that has no foundation and that is really, in my view, a military coup d'etat or military intelligence coup d'etat of the President of the United States. And of course, if Trump goes out, then we get Pence. And Pence is a lot more sophisticated. He's a lot more, he has a lot more experience in working with government and would be able to push through these neocon conservative agenda, I think, in a much more efficient way. So, but I think that it sets a precedent for allowing the intelligence community, along with the military industrial complex, if you want, to overthrow our government, to overthrow what the people elected. It's a real dilemma because no, we don't want Trump, but do we want a coup d'etat?
And it also allows the discussion still to focus on Russia instead of having the Democratic Party become introspective and look at what its policies should be if it wants to stand up and represent the American public.
Laurel?
So, are we really worried about other countries buying into we must attack Russia or we must pursue a more aggressive stance against Russia based on our claim that they interfered in our election, when that is outside the boundaries of the United States? That's laughable. I mean, the understanding of who we are is, I think, is pretty clear worldwide, with the exception of inside our borders. So I wonder whether after Colin Powell's speech to the UN to get everybody to go and attack Iraq, I wonder what kind of purchasing power any of this has outside the U.S. boundaries.
Yeah, well, I think what happens is these latest sanctions against Russia, the real target were the German banks, because the German banks were funding some of the North Sea pipeline from Russia to Germany. And the United States was saying, if you're dealing in financial things supporting Russia, you're not going to be able to play games with us. And so, from that sense, this thing does have an impact. In terms of whether it would convince other countries, I don't think so. I mean, just, through the sanctions, it plays a role, though. The thing that has convinced a lot of the other countries is that the Eastern European nations that were part of the Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact, those countries are afraid of a Russian bringing them back into a, quote, reconstituted Soviet Union. Particularly the Baltic states are very concerned. Poland's concerned, and Georgia has some concern as well. Western part of Ukraine is concerned. So there are countries that certainly are on board with any military campaign against Russia because they are in that area close to Russia, where if Russia chose to do something, they would be easy pickings. I think Russia has said that, like in Ukraine, they don't want to go in there and try and take over Ukraine because you don't want to go in when half the population would be against you. You're being occupying force, and it would be very, very costly and drain you of resources. And after Afghanistan, Russia, the Soviet Union, occupations don't work very well, particularly when you're viewed as an occupying force and hostile to a large portion of the population. So, but I think, these other countries have this fear of a Russian incursion or whatever. So some of those countries and some of the NATO allies just go along because it's the United States, and they'll go along with whatever we say.
For how much longer?
Yeah, I think Germany is the SPD candidate in Germany calls for the removal of U.S. nukes from German soil, and German, I think it was the foreign minister, also came out and supported that.
And he said the
U.S.
defense,
Nukes in Germany.
Right.
the defense minister in Germany also said that, I think it was, wasn't it the defense minister said that Russia was no threat to Germany.
Yeah.
And I think that Russia hasn't really taken actions to indicate that it's planning on invading anyone. I think it does feel like when NATO is putting, we've got offensive and defensive weapons right on Russia's borders. And last week, or in the last couple of weeks, Russia has been doing some military exercises within its own borders. And it was accused of provoking, conflict by, and here NATO is all along Russia's borders, and Ukraine was kind of it was like the red line. You're not going to come into Ukraine and occupy Ukraine. Well, they did do a, the U.S. was behind the coup d'etat there in 2014. But Russia hasn't really taken offensive. It did go into Crimea. There was an election there of the people. Most of them are Russians, ethnic Russians. They voted to go back with Russia. They had been part of Russia. There's a lot we could go into that too. But why don't we let people ask questions and make comments?
Yeah, with reference to like the FBI, the DNI, all the organizations. Now, I agree that they are some of the worst organizations in the world. Okay, they participated in assassinations, overthrowing governments, falsifying elections, on and on and on. Now, both of you have referenced the intelligence professionals. Now, these are all people who were in those particular agencies, either supervising or knowing about what was going on. So I have a difficult time accepting them at face value, that they're really all of a sudden have become really good guys and are blowing the whistle because they have nothing to lose. I have a real skeptical.
Go ahead.
Yeah. If you look at the people who have not told the truth to Congress or to the American public, it's generally the political appointees. Within the agencies themselves, people express their displeasure with the political appointees' comments and positions, and they push it as far as they feel they can. And some people have resigned in protest, but most of them don't. They remain within the agency, still trying to affect policy change within the agency. So I don't think either Carolyn or I are saying that necessarily all the people in the CIA, all the people in the NSA, all the people in the FBI are bad people. And a lot of people don't see the big picture, but Binney and McGovern were in positions that they had a pretty good feel for what the big picture is. And they've expressed their opinion, but in like 2002, when Cheney was telling Tenet, I want these results, basically, and Tenet said, okay, and he got the results, but there was real level of protest and dissatisfaction within the CIA, and that's why the CIA had determined not to allow that to be done. If you look at in 2007, the national intelligence estimate on Iran. Cheney and Bush wanted to have grounds for military attack on Iran, and the national intelligence estimate in these agencies said there's absolutely no evidence that Iran has a nuclear weapons program that's active today. They were determined not to allow another disaster and debacle like in 2002 with the weapons of mass destruction claim that Bush and Cheney used to take us into an illegal, immoral war against Iraq. So even though these people are unknown to the great public, they're not the political appointees who are lying to the American public. They are people who are working from within the system, trying to change the system. And they had some impact in 2007, as an example, an important impact, when the National Intelligence estimate from all 17 intelligence agencies, said that Iran does not have a nuclear weapons program. So that was a major thing. That was a big deal. When you have these agencies going against the interest of the deep state, if you will, I think they have some credibility. When they're complying with the interest of the deep state, then you need to look at it carefully to try and determine whether this is really the way it is, as best you can, or whether this is a political decision.
And McGovern has a good track record, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you have to listen to these people and, see what you think.
No, I have. I've listened
Yeah.
to McGovern. I've listened to Blenny.
Benny?
They make very good, cogent arguments. But isn't that the agencies that they really come from, that you're supposed to be able to sell it?
Well, what I
So
told you,
Iran's been against the
Totally.
agency many
what I
times.
mentioned about Benny in the beginning was that Benny was the former NSA technical director and for the NSA, and he opposed the spying on American citizens. He said we have to really limit this to people who are actually dangerous to us. We can't be collecting. This is a violation of the Constitution and people's rights to privacy. And he was, as I said, they came to his house and they basically took him out. I mean, and they took, I don't remember exactly what happened, but he was in the shower. They dragged him out of the shower. I mean, because he wanted to do this very limited program that would not, and that was also encrypted, so that even the limited people that they were looking at would not be spied on unnecessarily, and no one would know that data unless was really needed. Instead, they put in this very broad spying thing. So you kind of have to look at the people as individuals as well.
I didn't want to have this turn
No, it's an
into a
important.
lecture on.
I asked myself that too.
But
I
how does
also
that
think
affect
that
going in against nuclear, I'm a little more interested in what are your prescriptions for avoiding a nuclear war? Will exposing these leaks lead to less chance, more chance, no chance of nuclear war? That's what I'd like to hear.
Well, I think what the impact so far of these claims of Russian involvement has heightened the risk of a conflict, because it has convinced the American public to a large extent that Russia is doing bad things and harming the U.S. democracy. So I think that it's important that the American public realize that this is not necessarily the case. If nothing else, we should demand evidence instead of just accepting, trust us. Okay?
So I'm Matt Nicodemus, and I'm one of the people that has been engaged in discussion and debate with Carolyn, Ron, with Libertarian friend out in San Francisco over these issues. And I put together a handout today, which basically makes no claims. It's called Questions and Resources Regarding Investigation of Possible Russian Intervention in the 2016 U.S. Election and Alleged Trump Campaign Collusion with that intervention. And I think the only statement that I make in here, of which I'm certain, is the very last question. The very last question, which is, do we understand that at this point it is impossible to draw any final conclusions as to the truth or falsity of allegations regarding Russian intervention in the 2016 U.S. campaign and election and/or Trump campaign collusion with Russian intervention? We cannot draw any final conclusions. But I think, would everyone here call themselves a left progressive? Yes, okay. We are trying to build movements to make this a better world. And we are trying to bring people together to do that. And I'm very concerned with how we are viewed by people who can be our allies and who can, join us in our efforts. When we are presenting a face with statements that lead people to not take us seriously and to judge that our analyses are at the very least confused, if not wrong, or even worse. And I'll just point out a couple things. Tonight, everything has been focused on the DNC alleged hack. I watch a lot of the mainstream media. And the mainstream media, and I watch it because I'm able to do other things while I'm watching it. Usually MSNBC. And I watch it because the material that they're reporting, it's usually not actually TV reporters. They're usually reporting things that have been done in print media by reporters, by investigative reporters for many different mainstream newspapers, not only the New York Times and the Washington Post, but the Guardian and literally many papers that are finding out information about these matters on a nearly daily basis. Two of the resources that I list in here are timelines, one of them on Bill Moyer's site and the other on Mother Jones. The last two, Democracy and Government Interactive Timeline, Everything We Know About Russia and President Trump, explore our updated comprehensive Trump-Russian timeline. This is by Northwestern professor Stephen Harper, and it's constantly updated with information that has been taken from a variety of sources. Second, The Long, Twisted, and Bizarre History of the Trump-Russia Scandal. Here's the timeline you need to keep track of the controversy by Hanna Levintova. And this was first published March 24th of this year, and it's updated regularly. There were 4 different alleged types of Russian hacking. 1 was the DNC. 2 was Podesta through phishing. And assumedly, that other Democratic officials were also being phished. And does everyone know PHISH? What this means? Right.
Yeah, but explain it so I know for sure.
Oh, it's basically just that some kind of an email will come to you where you are somehow convinced to give them like your password, to give them information about yourself that will then allow them to hack into your computer.
Right, okay.
Okay. Third is the allegedly massive, and this news just coming out on this in the last couple days, Facebook and other social media platforms were basically advertising was purchased on Facebook by what appeared to what later have now been identified as Russian accounts paying for advertising, but I guess it was disguised or something at the time.
False stories.
Yeah.
False.
Yeah, which then were
that's
posting
what I
false
think.
stories
Yeah.
on social media. Also, bots, what are called bots, and these are robot programs which scour the web constantly and are able to do so because they have many of them and they're operating at high speeds. That if I posted something, say for Hillary, right, or for Bernie, or whatever, that they could attack you and, go against you, put fake news in, to challenge what you were saying. And the final one was hacking of, they've now identified 21 separate United states where the election processes, the voter rolls, the voter registrations, that those were hacked. And that people found themselves going into voting places to vote and not being able to vote because they had been removed. And that these were also identified, if I remember correctly, as Russian hacks into these. Now, the fact is tonight, we've been here, and I do not have an opinion myself on, I'm very open to the possibility of what was said about the VIPS, Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, of their case against the hack. I have no idea. But I do know that these other 3 areas of hacking have been alleged. I do know that an official, a Russian official, at a conference, a computer conference, within a Russian computer conference, announced last summer, I believe it was, that he said, we now have the equivalent of the atomic bomb in terms of cyber, and people are soon going to see it used. This was a public statement at a conference, which was, fully documented.
Who said this?
It was a Russian official who spoke.
Okay.
We have Donald Trump speaking to the TV and saying, Russia, if you're listening, you might want to check out Hillary's emails. We have Donald Trump Jr. when an email comes to him saying, we have information, Russian Ron Goldstone said, this guy who I know, I think is Turkish or Azerbaijani, I can't pronounce his name. He has information from what he called the Crown Prosecutor of Russia, but he's a Brit and he didn't understand that in Russia. It's not called the Crown Prosecutor. It's basically the top prosecutor, who is Cheka, I think his name is, who's a close friend of Putin's. That from him, from this guy, we have information for you about the Clinton campaign, and we would like to give it to you. This was the set of emails, the back and forth, which Donald Trump Jr. then released in full, where he said, if what you say is true, I love it, especially if it comes in June.
Matt, not to cut you off, but how does this tie into your opening statement of critical analysis?
Oh, no, what I'm saying is that what we've heard tonight is that there's no, if you were just to listen to this, that there's no evidence. And if people who are listening to the news and reading the news every day, if people in our community who we are trying to connect with and we're trying to communicate with, if they hear us say there's no evidence, what are they going to think?
Matt, what we're saying is the thing that started all of this was the claim of a Russian hack of the DNC emails. And we are saying that that's the thing that started everything, and there's been no evidence of that. Now, the fact that...
And I agree,
The
maybe
fact
that's fine, but what
that
about
the
everything
fact
else?
that-
That's where we are now.
The fact that everybody now, after over a year, almost a year and 3-4 months, there's been nothing to back up that statement. People are desperate and they're grasping at straws, and these things, turns out that the email involving Trump Jr., the woman wanted to talk about adoption of children. It had nothing to do with Hillary.
But there, Donald Trump, it's now known that Donald Trump on Air Force One actually wrote Donald Trump Jr.'s excuse after the first email was found to be false.
So?
That Trump wrote this thing saying it was just about the adoption thing. And at that point, they were still claiming that there were only, I believe, 3 people in the room. This was an event where every single day, and again, because reporters were working and getting different information, including leaks from within the Trump administration. They're getting information that every day showed that the previous day's statements had been lies. There is just a constant string of lies, and again, it doesn't prove a particular point yet, but there's so many lies. There's so many. Jared.
Okay, I'm
Jared
gonna cut you off, Matt, because you've been going
Sure,
for
no
10,
problem, no
10
problem.
minutes, and I want to give
Yeah.
other people. And I just want the thing I want to say is, yes, we may have credibility problems with people who watch the mainstream media 24/7. And because there has been really a propaganda campaign on this issue, and so it's going to be, people have been brainwashed into believing what the mainstream media, and I think there is a very strong CIA media, corporate media tie. Remember, these are huge conglomerate corporations. 6 corporations own most of the media in the United States. So we're not talking like, hometown newspaper. We're talking huge corporations that have an interest, that are part of the media corporate congressional intelligence complex. So there are definitely these stories are planted in for a reason.
All
And
of the different evidence is being planted.
Yes, I think a lot of it is, and these latest stories about Facebook and all this stuff. There's no evidence.
But
Well,
Mark
not-
Zuckerberg admitted that this happened. He admitted it publicly.
So personally,
I'm
I think
talking
there's enough
about-
blame to go around. I think there's so much dirt on every side of the political game. But what Carolyn started off with is all of this is a distraction to have kept us from nominating Bernie. And that's my biggest concern, is that they know how to put the shiny object out there, and there's no end of shiny objects. But the bottom line problem is that the Democratic Party in this country was so incredibly corrupt that it let itself be manipulated into nominating the person that was not the preferred candidate. And so to me, that's the big problem, and that's what all of this really is pointing out, that they were able to distract us from being able to concentrate on what was really important here.
Well, and I mean, the other piece of this is I think you really have to question anything you read in the mainstream media. It's a huge corporate intelligence agency complex, and their purpose is and part of the agenda there was to make sure that Bernie didn't get the nomination. But so if our credibility depends on us spouting the same information that the mainstream media is putting out there, then I don't want to be part of this. This isn't a revolution. It's nothing. It's just being part of the system that's destroying everything on this planet. I mean, what we've tried to do is see what alternative voices are saying on this, and look at alternative evidence, and say there's a lot of questions here. There's a lot of questions here, and that it's pretty clear from the forensic evidence that this was not a hack, that it was a leak based on what very credible people are saying. And if that's the case, what's the agenda here? Why did it happen? And that it had to, as McGovern and Binney said, it had to involve the CIA because they were the ones that had these very sophisticated tools to be able to obfuscate the Guccifer 2 quote hack and put these Russian fingerprints on it. This was not, the CrowdStrike didn't have those kind of tools. So this was clearly a very high level operation that happened. So, people have to make up their own minds, in my view. Anyone else want to?
Well, I just want to reiterate what you said, in the sense that what started all this was the claim of a hack of the DNC. Everything else is based on that, whether it's a fact or a lie. And what we're saying is that you need to question that, because we see that there's a lot of evidence suggesting that that whole claim was a lie. Now, if we took some other position just to stay friends with our allies based on a falsehood, I don't think that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to be responsible and seek the truth and tell the truth. And we're saying that the truth is that there are questions about this. And why are you continuing to claim that Russia hacked this, the DNC emails? So that for us to do anything else, I think, is irresponsible.
And if it wasn't so risky in terms of nuclear war, maybe we wouldn't be pushing us hard on this. But I think the dangers of nuclear war are very high. Stephen Cohen, who's been a Russian scholar for 50 years, says he's never seen anything like the relationships with Russia. They're at the worst point they've ever been. And there are people in the U.S. military who are talking about limited nuclear wars. And, these latest diplomatic relationships just sinking to an all-time low. Russia basically saying, we've kind of had it. Putin keeps reaching out to the United States and saying, you're our partner. And at this point, I think he's saying, we no longer feel like you're a partner because, first of all, you never tell us the truth, and you're always demonizing us. And so, it's a very dangerous situation.
Thank you all.